I'm here today with Dr. Yolanda Pierce. Dr. Pierce is professor and dean of Howard University School of Divinity. She's a scholar of African American religious history, womanist theology, race and religion, as well as a public theologian, activist, and commentator. An alumna of Princeton University and Cornell University, Dr. Pierce served as the founding director of the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Dr. Pierce's writing has appeared in Time, Sojourners, and the Christian Century, and she's also the author of a book called Hell Without Fires. The reason why we're here with her today is she has just launched a new book that is called In My Grandmother's House, Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit. So Dr. Pierce, it's so wonderful to have you here with us today.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to reconnect. We were reminiscing a few minutes ago that we'd worked together at a writers conference several years ago at Princeton Seminary. So
that's right.
It's really great to see you continuing in the trade book world. So
yes.
Maybe you can just tell folks a little bit more about your background than what I was able to convey.
Sure. I mean, you probably hit the highlights, but for all of my academic career, I have been teaching and writing at the intersection of religion and literature. That's where my PhD, I have a PhD in religion and literature. So I am one of those people who could not choose a field. And so I had to choose two fields. And so I think about literature as, for me, being so theologically rich and inflected. And then, of course, I was interested in religion, the study of American religion. My specialties include the African American church, the Black church, and womanist theology on the religion end. But on the literature end, it's African American literature. And so for a number of years, for 10 years, actually, I taught at Princeton Theological Seminary, where I taught courses in religion and literature, where I taught courses like spiritual autobiography. I taught American religion and American literature. And so in the 3 years since I've been dean at the Howard University School of Divinity, I'm not in the classroom as often, but when I am, it's just a pleasure. And this past semester, I taught a class on Toni Morrison as theologian. Toni Morrison was my undergraduate professor at Princeton University.
Great.
And so in tribute to her life, she passed away recently. In tribute to her life, I taught a course called Toni Morrison as Theologian, and really looking at the intersection between Toni Morrison's and womanist theology. So that's my background. It is wonderful. I have a passion for this material.
Wow. That's so great that you got to work with her and give a class about her too.
Yes.
So before we kind of get into the book, tell us a little bit about what kind of transitions you've had to have at Howard. I mean, through the pandemic, my goodness.
Okay, so I came to Howard University School of Divinity in 2017. Last year, right after spring break, the president of the university made the decision that we were not going to be returning to face-to-face instruction, like almost every other school in the country. That was last year. We have spent the entire academic year doing online classes. It's been a learning experience. It's been tough. It is not my particular specialty. I miss people. There's something about theological education that I really think needs the interaction of people with one another. If you're doing pastoral care, if you're teaching people about death and dying, there's some things that we do in theological education that I think really actually need people to be in community, in contact with one another. But of course, we had to make the transition. Our students have been gracious and wonderful and kind. I will tell you, I am looking forward to fall of 2021, when hopefully all of us will be returning back to the classroom.
Yes, aren't we all, right?
Yes.
I just can't imagine, how much of work the transition.
Oh, it's a ridiculous amount of work. It's far more work to do this because you're worried about the platform, the technology, and then the pedagogy has to shift. And I think that for people who are not in the field, that they don't sort of think through that, right? The pedagogy shifts, that it isn't just turning on your camera and you lecture like the students are there, but how do you get them talking to one another? How do you do small groups? How do you facilitate really a learning community? And so that's really critical, and it's hard to do online. We've done it, but I'm looking forward to when we don't have to do it again.
Do you think it'll be a hybrid situation?
Probably. I think so. I mean, the picture changes every week. The vaccine is changing things significantly in our country. DC has been very cautious, and so we follow the recommendations of our city, Washington, DC. So depending on what our mayor tells us, and even in August, we may or may be hybrid, depending on the number of people that she allows to gather in a classroom. I imagine it's some kind of hybrid situation, but our goal is certainly to bring as many people back as possible.
Sure, sure. So let's talk about books now. So before we get into the new book, can you tell us a little bit about the previous writing that you've done?
So I work in 18th and 19th century African-American autobiography, primarily slave narratives, memoirs, the writing that really emerged by African-American people out of slavery. And that writing for me is religiously inflected. And so that's why I've chosen that as my specialty. And so in Hell Without Fires, I had written about the spiritual narratives of two men and two women. And so spiritual narratives, as opposed to slave narratives, which is also a genre, because these particular writings really focused on their spiritual development, how they got to know God, how did they understand who God was in their lives, even in the institution of slavery, how they dealt with, for a couple of the writers that were eventually free. And so I'm really interested in the complicated relationship between how African Americans adopted and adapted Christianity. I was really honored to be a part of the PBS documentary, The Black Church, which was produced by Henry Louis Gates. And I talked quite a bit in that documentary about this, to make the suggestion, which I know through the scholarly work, African Americans transformed Christianity in this country. They did not come here as enslaved persons, as empty vessels. Many of them brought traditions and religious practices and beliefs that survived the Middle Passage. So what we see within African-American Christianity is always inflected by the African. So it was a joy to work on that project as well.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, how did the new book come about? What drove that to happen?
So in my grandmother's house, as the title suggests, I am thinking deeply about, I was raised by my grandparents, and that is a wonderful experience all by itself, to be raised by grandparents. For the people who've had that experience or are very close to their grandparents, there's nothing quite like it. But for me, what the book is about is an everyday womanist theology, which is to say that I was watching as my grandmother and the church mother. So this is an actual church office in the tradition in which I grew up. We had church mothers. And so I was watching as my grandmother and the church mothers really embodied for me a theology that later on, when I was a student and a graduate student and a professor, I had names for that theology. Right? The formal names. I had soteriology and eschatology. My grandmother didn't have that. These church mothers, these Black women didn't have that. But they raised me with such a tremendously rich theology. And so I wanted to write a book that is a series of essays that talks about theology. And I go into soteriology. I go into, for me, raised in a holiness Pentecostal tradition, sacramental theology, and the like, but through the lens of my grandmother, the church mothers, and the experiences of Black women. One of the most important things that I have found as a theologian, so I'm a womanist theologian, and I say this to my students in the classroom, you know that you have mastered a subject when you can explain it to a child. The mastery of a subject is not, I have read everything that there is to read about Bonhoeffer. That's not the mastery of the subject. The mastery of the subject is, to explain it to a 5-year-old, to explain it to someone who's never read any Bonhoeffer, to explain it to a person on the street. What do you do? I study Bonhoeffer. Okay, tell me what that is. And they don't have any German, they don't have it right. And you explain it to them. And so for me, this is an attempt to say, I was raised with such a powerful and rich theology. I want it accessible to anyone. And so I use this theme of being raised in my grandmother's house to talk about womanist theology and the incredible gift that it has been to American Christianity.
Wow. So it sounds like it's kind of bridging a gap between, kind of academic theology and very practical.
Yes, and that was exactly my intention, to bridge a gap between formal academic theology, in which I was trained, in which I teach, and the everyday practical on the ground. How do we live and love and learn and raise kids and send our children to school and go to work? That theology, and that I learned in the church. I talk about the learning to pray. My grandmother taught me to pray. I was, 5, 6 years old, and we would kneel down at the end of my tiny little twin bed in my room, and she would pray, and she would give me the words to say that I would learn how to pray. And so someone could easily say, oh, well, that's just, a mother or grandmother teaching their child to pray. But what she was really instilling in me was a prayer practice, right? And so we have lots of theology about prayer. For most of us, it begins not when we're learning about prayer as a graduate student, but really those men and women who taught us to pray with very simple words, right? Very simple gestures of prayer. And so I want to bridge that divide that for me seems to exist between the academy and then the folks who are in the pew. So there's this theological academy, and it's wonderful and it's rich. And then there are the folk who, go to church on Sunday. And often it feels like they're having two vastly different conversations.
Yes. No, I think it's a really valuable bridging.
Thank you.
So I bet you have a bunch of great stories in the book too. Your grandmother and the church mothers.
Yes. Well, one of my favorite stories that I tell in the book, and then I have more stories, but this is one of my favorite one, is I talk about foot washing. So as someone who grew up in the holiness Pentecostal tradition, foot washing is considered a sacrament for us. And so it was practiced on a fairly regular basis. It wasn't like a special occasion type thing. It was foot washing on, fairly regularly. Didn't know exactly what the schedule was. I was a kid. And let me tell you, as a kid, and particularly as a teenager, you don't want anything to do with grown-ups' feet. Like, you don't want to hear feet. You don't want to see feet. You don't want to do foot washing. And so I talk about like being the teenager. That's a very real thing. And as a teen, you're making decisions about soon to go to college, and how soon will I be out of this church and out of these traditions, and how crazy is all of this. And so I recall this story where my grandmother and the church mothers washed my feet before I went away to college. I was 16 when I left home to go to college. And that was actually the last time I actually lived at home, when I was a 16-year-old. And so I didn't know that. Of course, you don't know that then. And in certain ways, I think about how sacred that experience was to me, that they were preparing me for a life that I could not even imagine, because what do you know? Nothing. Nothing at 16. But you think you know everything. And so they were preparing me for a life and a world, and they were preparing me to face some forces and powers and principalities, and I didn't even know it. And the gentleness and the tenderness with which they washed my feet, it has always stayed with me as probably the most holy and sacred experience that I've had. Wow. And so I share that to talk about, that's what sacrament is. Sacramental theology, we would say in the academy, is the way that God's grace shows up in everyday life. That's what a sacrament is. And their grace for me just showed up, in that moment.
So is your grandmother still with us?
No, she is not. She passed away many years ago.
Wow.
But like I said, raised by her and my grandfather, and raised in a fairly small church and extended family community. And it has just been with me all my life, and I'm so grateful.
Well, her legacy lives on through the book and other ways, I'm sure, too. But that's really nice that you honor her that way.
Thank you.
So how's the book organized?
So there are 12 chapters, and they are to be read, and you can read them in and out of order. So it's not necessarily in any chronological order. But each chapter for me looks at some theological tenet. I talk about soteriology and salvation in one of the chapters. Another chapter deals explicitly with prayer. One chapter deals with like the concept of grace. Another chapter deals with loss and death and dying. One of the things, and so this for people who are doing this kind of writing, I'm not writing a memoir, so it's not a memoir. So people always assume kind of like if you're writing from a personal vantage point that it's a memoir, but this actually is not. I'm not trying to tell a cohesive, story of my life from beginning to end, which I hope the end is a long, long way off. But instead, what I consider these to be are nonfiction essays that are really taking seriously the theology that I learned, and questions about race, questions about power, questions about marginalized people living on the edge. And so each of them are really meant to seriously consider some theological tenet, but wrapped up in stories connected to either my childhood or some of the stories emerge out of my years of teaching. Being a professor, I share one story in there about a wonderful student that I have, and he was a graduate student of mine, and he, during a particular incident, was one of my deacons. And so I tease him to this day. I was like, you are my favorite deacon. And so they can be read completely out of order, but the idea is that each of the chapters examines a theological tenet. And that's important for me because while my story as a Black woman growing up, inner city Brooklyn, tiny storefront church, Pentecostal holiness, that's my story. But the story within the story is in fact for me how men and women of faith need to be able to share their own stories, right? And so I don't ever want people to think, oh, well, this is a story that's really about and for Black women. This is a story written by a Black woman. But the way that we think about salvation, or the way that we think about how do we deal with death and dying, or what do we do when we sense that it's time to leave a space, because that space and that church hurt and that pain that sometimes comes from our religious spaces have been more than we can bear. And so it is the particularity of a Black woman's story, but it is also, I hope, very much so connected to people of faith everywhere who really had to wrestle, right, with their beliefs, wrestle with God. When we have more questions than answers, I think we're finally at a place where God is ready to engage. I have more questions having written this book than I have answers. And so therefore I'll just write another one.
I was just going to say plenty of opportunity for more books then, right?
Definitely. Much more to say.
So this book just came out from Broadleaf Books, and they've been putting out a very impressive array of different topics and different diverse authors, which I really give them a lot of credit for.
Absolutely.
Did they reach out to you for this? Did you have an agent that you reached out to them? How did that work?
They reached out to me, and so again, having done this work in theology and written scholarly work, but for at least the past 5-7 years, I've been writing for a much broader audience in mainstream publications like Time Magazine. I had written about God as Mother, and so I've been doing quite a bit of what I call translation work, right? Which is I see as part of my own calling, translating certain kinds of theological concepts for a mainstream audience. And so they reached out to me. I had a wonderful editor. She just worked with me every step of the process, and they were a really incredibly responsive press. So, I think finding the right press who will encourage your idea, who will let you live into what it is that you have in your heart to say, I think that I was very fortunate to find that.
Good. Well, I hope it works out, going forward too.
Thank you.
So speaking of which, do you have any plans for specific books that you can talk about yet? I mean, I don't want you to divulge anything you're not comfortable
No, so I can say I'm working on something about grief. And so I end this book in my grandmother's house on a very somber note. And I do that intentionally. I think that part of what maybe people expect you to do is to kind of say, and they all lived happily ever after. And that's just not the case. That's not the reality of life. I actually end the book on the note about my grandmother's death. And it is what it is. But what I want to talk about grief. And that's really important to me because there are a few common human experiences, right? So we can be very, very different by race and class and gender and our life experiences and what we've been through and where we grew up. And so the experience of a woman my age in Bangladesh is very different than the experience I'm having in Washington, D.C. But we will all lose someone that we love. And that common human experience, that common denominator, it humbles you. There's something about the process of grief that really humbles you. And so I've been doing quite a bit of teaching about grief and loss and preaching about grief and loss, and now a bit of writing about grief and loss. So that's what's coming next.
Well, good, good. Well, we'll look forward to that as well.
Thank you.
Yolanda, thank you so much for joining us and telling us about this new book and your work. I'm very excited for, what you've done and what you will be doing.
Thank you so much. It's just a pleasure to have the conversation with you.
Same here. Thanks again.
Uh-huh.